I want to give you another framework for how to think about whether you should buy a house or continue renting. Because it's a very common question, and I just got it again very recently from a buddy of mine. And his question was, in particular, if I can afford it, should I buy a house or would it be better financially to continue renting? And I'm going to maybe disappoint you here right in the beginning, but better to do it in the beginning than like later on in the video. It's not something that I'm going to be able to answer for you. There's no way. Nobody can answer that question for you except for yourself. Because first of all, if you want to buy a house, you're going to buy a house. It doesn't really matter what anybody else says. You're gonna buy a house. And there's all kinds of rules and like 1% rule, 3% rule, 5% rule. My buddy sent me an article about the 5% rule. And it was basically some calculations and numbers and looking at the mortgage and the rental costs and all this kind of stuff. And if the result of that exercise is more than 5%, then you should buy the house or something. I don't remember, right? You should buy the house. And if it's less than 5%, then you should continue renting because that's going to be more financially feasible. But those kinds of things are not really useful in helping you to make the decision. They're useful as frameworks after you've made the decision to then choose how much house you want to buy or what kind of apartment you want to rent. Because if you've already decided that you want to buy a house, you're just going to manipulate the numbers. Instead of a 3-bedroom house or a $5 million mansion, you're going to buy a $500,000 maybe condo or something. I don't know. And if you're very anti-landlord and you never want to be a capitalist pig, you're going to say, hey, look, it makes more sense to rent this stingy, cockroach-infested place than it is to buy the building. So it's going to be a self-fulfilling prophecy anyway. So those things are useful after you've already made the decision whether you want to buy or rent a house. But I want to talk about another thing, another method of thinking about this decision that's not really talked about very much. Very few people talk about this. And it's a shame because it's very simple and it explains what's happening so well that once you understand this, every other financial question that you have and decision that you're going to make, it becomes a lot easier to understand the implications of that a long time down the line, right? Buying a car, buying a new purse, buying a new house, rent, whatever. It doesn't really matter what it is. So that's what we're going to talk about. One thing that always really confused me was Grant Cardone saying that he rents where he lives and he owns all the places that he rents out. And that never made sense to me because, Grant Cardone is a wealthy guy and he can afford to buy his primary residence. I never understood why he didn't. Wouldn't it just be a lot easier to buy the place and then live in it for a little bit and then take the appreciation and transfer it over to another property or sell it or whatever, right? Because if you're renting, you're just throwing away money, right? Isn't that the deal when you rent? But it never made sense to me until I understood what I'm about to talk about right now. And then the light bulb went off in my head and I was like, okay, yeah, that makes a lot of sense. It makes a lot of sense. So let's get started. Let's get right into it here. I'm not going to talk too much about what these are. These are personal financial statements. They're very similar to the business financial statements. They work in exactly the same way. They just have different line items. But I'm not going to talk very much about this because I have a different video that explains in detail. It's a longer video that goes into detail what each one is and how they work. So I'm not going to do that in this video. But in this video, I want to show you sort of what the deal is going to be if you decide to buy a house, right? And this house is going to be your primary residence that you're going to live in. It's not going to be a rental property or anything like that. So here you have your 3 financial statements. You have the income statement, the balance sheet, and the cash flow statement right here, right? So when you buy a house, typically what you're going to say is, oh, okay, I'm going to put the house and my assets in my balance sheet, right? Because the house has a value and that's where it goes. And you're like, yeah, okay, that's right, sure. But typically when you buy a house, you're also going to buy that house with a mortgage. And that mortgage, let's just say it equals the value of the house. You do a 0% down mortgage and that equals the value of the house, right? Of course, it's going to be different. Like you might put 10%, 20%, 30% down or something. We're just going to keep it simple here. The mortgage equals the value of the house. So what's changed on your balance sheet? Absolutely nothing. You're still worth the same amount that you were worth before. And you might say, oh, yeah, well, the house is going to appreciate over time. And yeah, it should. Ideally, it should. It should keep track with inflation at least. But the numbers on the balance sheet over time, yeah, they should go up because the house is going to appreciate and you're going to pay down the mortgage. But let's look at how you're going to pay down that mortgage, right? The mortgage has to be serviced, and it has to be serviced from your income, your net income to be exact. So in order to pay this mortgage, here's what's going to happen. Basically, long story short, is that the net income that you generate is going to go to pay off your mortgage. And the cash flow statement is just going to describe what happens. You have this money coming in, and then it goes out, flows into the liabilities category here, which is the mortgage. Okay? So that's how that works. But when you buy a house, another thing that happens is, well, the house is going to cost you money to maintain. The most common thing that people point to is property taxes and maintenance. And like, yeah, okay, that happens. So when you buy a house, this is how the house affects the income statement. It adds expenses, and your expenses increase, right? You got to buy a washing machine, that's an expense. You got to buy a dryer, that's an expense. You got to fix your shingles, that's an expense. You got to redo the kitchen, that's an expense. You got property taxes, that's an expense. You have HOA fees if you bought a condo, that's an expense. So you got a lot of expenses associated with buying a house, right? All right, so if your expenses go up here, and let's say that your income just stays the same, if your income stays the same, then what happens to your net income? Your net income goes down. So that necessarily means that you're going to have less money to cash flow to the liability, to the mortgage here, right? So if you want to pay down this mortgage faster in order to gain equity in your house, you're going to have to increase your income in some way. That's the only way that that's going to happen. Now, you could say like, okay, yeah, well, I'm going to use my house as an asset. I'm going to Airbnb it out, or use it to make some money, or take like the living room and get a tax deduction because I'm using it for my business. Sure, that can happen. But in general, what the house is going to do is just give you a bunch of expenses, and it's not really going to put any line items on the income part of your income statement. It's just not going to happen. In general, it doesn't. There's always exceptions because people are like, I'm going to Airbnb my house out, or I'm going to live with 5 roommates and they're going to pay my mortgage. So yeah, it's possible. But I'm guessing if you want to buy a house, you're buying a house so that you can have privacy and that you can have your own stuff and not have to share it with a bunch of people like you did when you were renting, right? So that's kind of what happens. So there's not very much like positive things in terms of income and cash flow that are happening here. Your house, which you consider an asset, is just creating more expenses for you. It's just creating more expenses for you. And those expenses are then making it harder to pay for things. Like, you got to pay the mortgage, right? So if you want to also invest in more assets like your retirement fund or your after-tax stuff or whatever, other investment properties, it's going to make it harder to do that. So if you listen to Robert Kiyosaki talk, really what he says is that for most people, a house is actually a liability. A liability is something by nature that creates more expenses for you. It creates more expenses for you. It doesn't provide you any income. If you live in this house and don't do anything else with it, it's not providing you any income. It's just creating expenses for you. Now let's look just very quickly at what happens if instead of buying this house, you make this an investment property, right? Let's look at what happens in that case. You're still going to have to pay the mortgage like before, of course. You're going to still have to service that debt. But the asset that you have and this house is still going to create expenses for you, like the property tax and everything that you had before. But it's also going to provide you income. And you're going to have an increase of income on your income statement, right? Your expenses are also going to go up, right? But ideally, the ideal situation in this case is that, well, let's just pretend that nothing really happens in terms of your net income. It just stays the same. Well, then effectively what you have is the renters are paying off your mortgage. You don't have to like get a raise or budget more efficiently or anything like that in order to pay this off. It's just getting paid off by the renters. All your expenses are being covered by the rental income. But if you just buy the house and you live in it yourself, then that part goes away and you're left to figure out how else to increase your income on your own, whether it's getting another job or starting a business or whatever have you, right? But you have to figure out this part. The house is not going to help you with that. Now, of course, you might also think like, yeah, well, when the mortgage is paid off, then I'm going to own the house. Yeah. That's going to go away, but the expenses are still going to be there. It's not going to be as much before because you don't have the mortgage anymore, but you still have property taxes, you still have maintenance, You don't have to have the insurance that you had anymore, but it's still going to be there. Like a lot of those expenses don't go away. So that always remains. So now let's look at what happens if you were to just rent, right? And for rents, we're going to give it a box, because if you're renting, you obviously are living in a box, right? So if you rent, well, where does the rent go? Where does your rental thing go? All it goes is right here. It's an expense. And really doesn't show up anywhere else on any of your statements, right? And of course, because you're renting, well, your net income is going to go down. But it's the same thing that happens when you buy a house. Except the difference is with renting, when you have a house, you can't really control a lot of the expenses because you don't really know what they're going to be going into it, right? And every house is different. It's going to require different types of maintenance, and it's going to require different things for it. But when you're renting, the only thing that you got to pay is the rent. You see the rent and you'd be like, okay, that's what I'm going to be paying for a year, 2 years, or whatever. With a house, it's not really the same thing. Like the expenses related to a house can change. What's been happening in California is that the property taxes have been slowly creeping up over time. And people were not considering that when they bought a house like 15 or 20 years ago. So even people who are paid off their mortgage are like, this is getting way more expensive to own, and I'm not sure I can afford this anymore. So there's a lot of outside factors that are going to affect the expenses generated by buying a house than there are with simply just renting a place. So that's about it. That's about it. That's another way that you can think about buying a house, how it affects your personal financial statements. And it's not something that many people talk about. So I thought it would be a valuable component to add to the discussion here. And I just want to say, like, if you want to buy a house, you should buy a house. Like, don't let anybody tell you don't buy a house because it doesn't make sense financially or any kind of thing like that. Right? You have my permission to buy a house. Or if you want to rent, you have my permission to rent. Like, just make the decision on your own. Don't base it on somebody else's judgment. Like, if you want to buy a house, buy a house. Just do it. Whatever. It doesn't really matter. When you die, you're not going to pay rent anymore, and you're not going to be able to take the house with you. So it doesn't really matter. Like at the end of the day, like the purpose of owning a house, I think, is to own a piece of land and have something that you call your own, and then you can do whatever you want with. And that's great. If you like that feeling, that's fine. It doesn't really matter whether you rent or buy at the end of the day, but the implications on your financial statements are different. So that's just something to understand as part of the decision-making process. So that's it. Hope this was helpful. I will say one thing, though, that if you think that you own your house after you buy it, think again, because that's probably not true. And if you don't believe me, after you buy a house, just try not paying your property taxes. Let me know how it goes. I think you'll find out who the real owner of the house is. Bye-bye.